Her business trips were a cover for infidelity, and it was with my own nephew. I trusted her until the truth shattered me. Emily was everything to me. When I think about our 17 years together, I'm overwhelmed by a mix of pride, joy, and pain. We started with nothing: a rented apartment, cheap furniture, and dreams of building a life together. We built this home together, not just from bricks and concrete, but with trust, care, and, as I believed, true love. She wasn't just my wife. Emily was the person I turned to when life became unbearable. She always knew how to calm me down, how to restore my faith in myself. And I, in turn, was everything to her. Or at least, that's what I thought. That evening, Emily was getting ready for a business trip. She stood in front of the large mirror in our bedroom, carefully adjusting her hair. Her sleek black dress fit her perfectly. It was the same outfit she always chose for important meetings. But this time, something felt different. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching her. Her movements were smooth, but they seemed tense, as if she were trying to convince herself that everything was going according to plan. I smiled at her, trying to push away my doubts. She's my wife, I thought. Why would I even suspect anything? How do I look? She asked, turning to face me. Her voice sounded the same as always, gentle, confident, but with a faint hint of nervousness I'd never noticed before. You look stunning, I replied, and it was true. But along with those words, a sense of unease began to grow inside me. Her eyes met mine, but she quickly looked away. Emily stepped closer, leaned down, and kissed me lightly on the cheek. I'll be back Sunday. Don't wait up for me, she said, picking up her bag and heading to the door. Her words were casual, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a business trip. I stood to see her out. Be careful, okay? I said. She smiled again, but there was something unfamiliar in that smile. It wasn't the genuine smile I knew. It was a shadow of what once was real. The door closed, and I was left alone. In the silence of the house, I began analyzing every detail, every glance, every word. Why had she seemed so distant? Why had these trips become so frequent lately? Why was I feeling this unexplainable chill in our marriage? I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but it didn't help. My heart was beating faster than usual, and my thoughts were consumed by one thing. What was she hiding? If only I'd known that at that moment, she was already sitting in the car with my nephew, Trevor, a man I loved and trusted more than most in our family. If only I'd known where this lie, which started so innocently, would lead. After the door closed behind Emily, James was left alone with his thoughts. He sat for a long time in silence, staring at the spot where she had stood just minutes ago. His heart raced unevenly, and the same questions kept swirling in his mind. Why had she been so distant lately? What exactly had he missed? James tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, that 17 years of trust couldn't crumble because of a few strange glances or changed behavior. But something inside him told him this wasn't a coincidence. He sighed and rose from the couch. An idea spun in his head, one that seemed both humiliating and inevitable. Check her phone. Emily had always been careful, but this time, her haste played a cruel trick on her. She had left her phone on the kitchen table. James approached, pausing for a moment, staring at the device as if it were the key to all the answers. His hand trembled as he picked it up and pressed the lock button. Luckily, the password hadn't changed. It was the same code they had used for years. His fingers nervously scrolled through the screen. First, he checked her messenger. Most conversations seemed normal, messages from friends, colleagues, family group chats. But one chat caught his attention. The name, T. It was strange. James knew all her friends and colleagues, but he had never heard of anyone simply called T. When he opened the chat, James found only a few messages. They were short, without any obvious subtext, but still unsettling. "Can't wait to see you," read the last message Emily had received. Her reply was even more cryptic. "Be there soon. Just be careful." James's heart sank. Who was this T? What meeting? And why such caution? Finding nothing else significant, he placed the phone back, making sure Emily wouldn't notice anything unusual. But those messages lingered in his mind, refusing to let him rest. The next day, with Emily away on her trip, James decided to check her laptop. She usually left it at home, as she used a work device for her job. Opening the lid, he entered the password and began browsing through her files. At first, everything seemed normal: work documents, reports, family photos. But one folder had a strange name: personal. It was password protected. James's heart began to race. He recalled a date that had always been important to Emily, their wedding anniversary. He entered it, and the folder unlocked. What he found was unexpected. There were photos of Emily smiling, but she wasn't alone. In several pictures, she was with a man whose face wasn't fully visible. The camera angle seemed deliberate, as if to obscure his identity. In one of the photos, the man's hands were around her waist. James felt a wave of anger and despair wash over him. Who could this be? He zoomed in on the background, searching for clues. Then, he spotted something familiar, a detail he couldn't ignore. It was the number of a hotel they had once visited for an anniversary celebration. James clenched his fists, barely able to contain his emotions. The more he looked at the photos, the stronger his feeling grew that this man wasn't just some random stranger. The final blow came when he found an email in her inbox. It was a confirmation for a hotel booking, under the name Trevor. James couldn't believe his eyes. Trevor, his nephew. The same Trevor he had always supported, protected, and taken pride in. This wasn't just a coincidence or a misunderstanding. It was betrayal in its purest form. James couldn't sleep that night. Thoughts swirled in his mind. Is this real? Or am I overthinking what I've seen? He replayed every moment, every photo, every message in his head. But the worst part was knowing this wasn't just about a stranger. Trevor was family, his own nephew. The next morning, James made himself coffee, but it tasted like ash. His hand trembled as he held the cup. He knew he couldn't confront Emily right away. He needed proof. If he acted impulsively, Emily could deny everything, and Trevor could fabricate a convincing story. James decided to act smart. He needed the truth, the whole truth. Emily called later that day. Her voice was as usual, even a little cheerful. "Hi, love. How are you? Everything okay? I'll probably be late tonight. There's an important dinner." James took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Everything's fine, love. Don't worry, do what you need to," he replied, masking his unease. Emily sounded so normal, so innocent, and that only fueled his growing anger. James decided to start by checking her whereabouts. He remembered a shared app they'd installed years ago to track each other's locations for convenience. He opened it and saw Emily was downtown, at the same hotel they had once visited together. His heart tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. What is she doing at a hotel if this is a business trip? He wondered. At first, James considered rushing there immediately, but he chose to wait. He knew acting rashly could ruin everything. The next day, James decided to talk to people who might know more. Carefully, he brought up Emily in a conversation with her best friend, Sarah. Emily mentioned she's been really busy with work. "Have you talked to her recently?" he asked, hoping to glean some useful information. Sarah hesitated before responding. "We haven't spoken much lately. She seems a little distant these days, but maybe it's just work." Her tone was cautious, as if she was holding something back but didn't want to interfere. That evening, opening the shared computer, James found another crucial piece of evidence: email confirmations for a room reservation at the very same hotel where Emily had been staying. However, the most devastating detail was the reservation listing two names: Emily and Trevor. His doubts transformed into certainty, but he chose not to act rashly. That night, James turned on a hidden camera he had installed years ago for security purposes. It was positioned to capture any suspicious activities in the house. The next day, when Emily returned from her trip, she acted as if everything was normal, smiling, hugging him, and recounting how busy she had been with work. But there was something new in her eyes, an uneasiness, as though she sensed he might know something. James was at the edge of a nervous breakdown. The evidence he had gathered left little room for doubt, but he needed more. He wanted to witness the truth with his own eyes. The following day, he decided to take a step he'd never imagined: following Emily. He knew her usual route started from their home, But this time, she didn't drive toward the office as she normally did. Her car turned onto a side road, leading to the hotel that had already become a symbol of deception for James. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling on the wheel as he tried to follow her unnoticed. James parked at a distance and watched as Emily got out of her car. She stopped at the hotel entrance and glanced around as if waiting for someone. At that moment, Trevor approached her. A wave of fury surged through James. Trevor was dressed casually, his demeanor relaxed, but their interaction made James clench his fists. They hugged. Not a friendly embrace, but something warmer, more intimate. James stepped out of his car but hesitated. He didn't want to create a scene without a concrete plan. But fate had other ideas. Trevor turned his head and spotted him. Their eyes met. Trevor muttered something to Emily, who then turned to look in James's direction. Her face froze as though she had seen a ghost. James decided not to retreat. He walked closer, his heart pounding so loudly he thought everyone around could hear it. "Trevor, here on business too?" James began, trying to keep his voice calm, though inside he was a storm of emotions. "Hey, Uncle," Trevor replied as if nothing had happened. His smile was too composed, almost defiant. "Yeah, just meeting some acquaintances here." Emily stood silently beside Trevor, as if hoping her absence from the conversation would go unnoticed. "Acquaintances? Interesting. Did you two have dinner together too?" James raised an eyebrow, his tone cool but loaded with implication. Trevor stiffened slightly but quickly regained his composure. "No, I'm just here for a quick stop, dropping off some work documents." Emily finally spoke up, her voice tinged with irritation. "James, what are you doing here? You're scaring me." But there was fear in her eyes. "Scaring you? That's interesting, Emily. I could ask you the same. Why are you here instead of meeting clients as you said you would?" A tense silence fell between them. Trevor took a step back as if wanting to avoid the growing tension. "I think I should leave," he said, but James wasn't going to let him slip away so easily. "No, stay, Trevor. We can all talk together. After all, this is just a coincidence, isn't it?" Trevor and Emily looked as though they were searching for the right words, but couldn't find them. James felt certain they were hiding something, but neither was willing to admit it. "We'll talk at home, James," Emily said, attempting to lead him away from the escalating scene. James nodded, but was seething inside. He wasn't going to let this slide. Everything that had happened only solidified his suspicions, and now he was ready to act. James returned home, consumed by thoughts. His encounter with Emily and Trevor at the hotel left him with more questions than answers. He knew they were hiding something, but he couldn't force them to confess. The only way to uncover the truth was to monitor them discreetly. That night, sitting in his workshop, James held a small recording device he had purchased long ago for work. He knew this step would make him feel even worse, but the doubts were eating him alive. He needed the truth, even if it destroyed him. The next morning, when Emily went to the store, James planted the device in the living room. It was the perfect spot, as it was where they usually spent time together or entertained guests. He carefully hid it behind a decorative vase, ensuring it remained undetectable. For the next few days, everything seemed quiet. Emily behaved as usual, laughing, cooking dinner, even showing more affection than usual. But James could sense it was all a facade. Every time she spoke, there was a tension in her voice that he could now discern. One day, returning home early, James noticed the living room door slightly ajar. Voices were coming from inside. He recognized Emily's voice, but the other was Trevor's. His blood boiled, but he forced himself to step back and wait. "I can't stay long," Trevor's voice said. "James might get suspicious." "You think I don't know that?" Emily replied, her tone nervous. "He's already starting to notice things. We can't keep this up." James felt his heart tighten. He wanted to burst into the room and demand answers, but he held back. He needed concrete evidence, something undeniable. Later that evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, James retrieved the device from the living room and connected it to his computer. His hands trembled as he pressed the play button. The recording began with casual conversation. Emily asked Trevor about his work, his day. But gradually, the tone shifted, becoming more tense. "I can't keep this a secret anymore," Trevor said. Every time I see him, I feel like I need to tell him the truth. No, Emily interrupted. We agreed he would never find out. James wouldn't survive it. If he finds out, it won't be from me, Trevor replied. As the conversation continued, details emerged that James had hoped he'd never hear, but that confirmed his worst fears. Their meetings at the hotel, their plans, and how they'd been hiding this from him for months. James sat in the darkness of his study, listening to the recording over and over. Each word, each nuance in their voices, was like a dagger to his heart. Anger, pain, and betrayal overwhelmed him. His hands shook, but his resolve solidified. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't live in this lie any longer. Now, it was their turn to explain themselves. The confrontation. The next morning, James waited for Emily in the kitchen. When she walked in, cheerful and bright as usual, she froze at the sight of him. Her smile faded as soon as she saw his expression. "We need to talk," James said, his tone cold and firm. Emily took a few steps back, as though searching for an escape. "What's wrong, James? You look angry." "Angry?" He laughed bitterly. "You have no idea how angry I am." James pulled out his phone and hit play on the recording. Emily and Trevor's voices filled the room. Her face went pale as she heard her own words. "What is this?" she asked, trying to feign surprise, but her voice wavered. "This is the truth, Emily. Your truth. And now I want to hear it from you," James said, staring directly into her eyes. Emily tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. At that moment, the doorbell rang. James stood up and opened the door to find Trevor standing there. His face was calm, but only on the surface. "Good morning, Uncle," Trevor said, but his voice faltered when he saw Emily behind James. "Come in, Trevor," James said, stepping aside. "I think we all have a lot to discuss." The truth unveiled. When all three sat at the table, the silence was almost unbearable. James placed the phone on the table and replayed the recording. Trevor and Emily avoided his gaze, which only fueled his anger. "How long has this been going on?" James finally asked, his voice steady but his eyes stormy. "James, I can explain," Emily began. "I don't want explanations. I want the truth," James interrupted. Trevor leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "It was a mistake. We never meant to hurt you." "A mistake?" James exploded. "You think this is about me? You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our entire family." Emily began to cry, but James ignored her. He was too consumed by anger to feel any pity. "How long?" he demanded. "A month? A year? I want to know everything." Emily finally confessed. "It started a few months ago. I don't know how it happened. It was a mistake, and I regret it every day." "Regret?" James looked at her with disdain. "If you regret it, why did it go on for so long?" Trevor tried to justify himself. "We thought about stopping." But what?" James cut him off. "You enjoyed destroying everything we built over 17 years? After several minutes of emotional tension, James couldn't take it anymore. He stood up from the table and looked at them both with bitterness. "You've lost me. And if you think I'll forgive this, then you clearly don't know me at all," he said, leaving the room. As James walked away, the weight of betrayal felt heavier than ever. He knew his life would never be the same, but one thing was clear. He was done living in the shadows of their lies. The room fell silent as the recording played. Emily's voice, trembling yet familiar, and Trevor's, steady yet damning, filled the space. Every word was like a hammer striking the fragile facade they had built around their betrayal. Emily's face turned pale, her lips trembling as she struggled to process what was happening. Trevor's once relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by visible panic. He glanced around the table, meeting the shocked gazes of family members who had once trusted and respected him. When the recording ended, James put the phone down on the table. His expression was cold, resolute. He looked directly at Emily and Trevor, who were both too stunned to speak. "You both thought I wouldn't find out," James began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You thought you could lie to me, betray me, and that I'd just live in ignorance. But today, I take back control. Today, you both face the consequences of your actions." Emily finally found her voice, though it was shaky and weak. James, please. I didn't mean for this to happen. Didn't mean for what to happen, Emily? James interrupted sharply. The lies? The betrayal? The months of sneaking around behind my back? Spare me your excuses. Trevor tried to interject. Uncle James, it wasn't supposed to. Don't you dare, James cut him off, pointing a finger directly at him. You were family. You were supposed to be someone I could trust. And you chose to destroy that trust for your own selfish reasons. The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. Some whispered to one another, but no one dared to intervene. I didn't plan this lightly, James continued, addressing the table now. I've spent weeks gathering the evidence, making sure I had the full picture before speaking out. I won't let this stay hidden. Everyone deserves to know what kind of people they truly are. He turned back to Emily. 17 years, Emily. 17 years of love, loyalty, and commitment. And this is how you repay me? Emily broke into sobs, burying her face in her hands. I made a mistake, James. Please. I'm sorry. I'll do anything to make it right. James shook his head, his expression unmoving. You don't get to decide that anymore. I gave you everything, and you threw it away. He then turned to Trevor, his voice filled with disdain. And you. I don't even have the words for what you've done. You've not only betrayed me but this entire family. Don't think for a second there won't be repercussions. Trevor lowered his head, unable to meet James's gaze. James took a deep breath, his tone softening slightly but still firm. I've already spoken to my lawyer. Emily, I'm filing for divorce. Trevor, don't expect to be welcome in this family again. Gasps rippled through the room, but James wasn't finished. As for the rest of you, he addressed the family, I'm not asking for sides or sympathy. I simply wanted the truth to be known. What you do with it is up to you. With that, James grabbed his jacket and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. Emily's sobs and Trevor's uneasy shifting were the only sounds in the aftermath of his revelation. For James, this was the beginning of a new chapter. It was painful, but it was also liberating. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but the knowledge that he had reclaimed his dignity and exposed the truth gave him the strength to move forward. The family gathering, once a symbol of unity, had turned into a stage for truth and accountability, a necessary end to a painful deception. As the truth continued to unravel, James felt the weight of betrayal grow heavier. Each new revelation was another nail in the coffin of his trust, not just in Emily, but in the people around him who had chosen silence over honesty. The room was suffocating with tension. Emily sat paralyzed, tears streaming down her face, while Trevor looked as if he were ready to bolt. James stood motionless, absorbing the new information like blows from an unseen adversary. You knew? James turned sharply to his brother, Thomas. You knew years ago, and you said nothing? Thomas hesitated, his face a mix of guilt and regret. I didn't know how to tell you, James. I thought, maybe it was a misunderstanding. And when nothing came of it, I convinced myself it was better left alone. Better left alone? James's voice rose, shaking the room. You watched me live a lie. You let her destroy everything I thought we built together. And you, he turned to Sarah, whose earlier confession still stung. You both knew and said nothing. I was scared, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I thought it would only make things worse. James shook his head in disbelief. You were scared? I lived in a house of lies, surrounded by people who claimed to care about me but chose silence instead of courage. Emily suddenly burst into sobs, her voice frantic. James, please. I made mistakes, yes, but I never stopped loving you. I thought I could fix this. I thought we could fix this. Fix this? James said coldly. How do you fix years of deceit? How do you fix a heart that's been shattered repeatedly, Emily? She reached out, but James stepped back, his eyes filled with disdain. No, you don't get to touch me. You don't get to plead for forgiveness when you've spent years destroying the very foundation of our life together. Trevor, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. Uncle James, I I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear. James cut him off with a sharp gesture. Stop. I don't want to hear your excuses. You've not only betrayed me, you've betrayed this entire family. Don't think for a second that your actions will go without consequences. James looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each stunned face. This isn't just about Emily and Trevor. It's about every single one of you who knew something and said nothing. Your silence made you complicit. He turned back to Emily, his voice cold and resolute. You've taken everything from me, my trust, my love, my pride. And now, I'll take everything from you. James paused, his next words deliberate and final. I'm filing for divorce. I'm going to ensure you leave this marriage with nothing but the consequences of your actions. Gasps rippled through the room, but James wasn't finished. He turned to the rest of the family. And as for you, Trevor, don't think this is the end. I've already spoken to a lawyer. You'll answer for what you've done, not just to me, but to the family you've betrayed. That night, James packed his belongings and left the house, leaving Emily and Trevor to face the fallout. His mind was a storm of anger and sorrow, but beneath it all, there was a new resolve, to rebuild his life on his own terms. In the days that followed, James focused on uncovering every last thread of the truth. He contacted people from Emily's past, carefully piecing together the timeline of her betrayals. Conversations with old friends and acquaintances confirmed what he had feared. Her infidelity wasn't a one-time mistake. It had been a pattern of deception. Each new piece of evidence only strengthened James's determination. He worked with his lawyer to ensure that the divorce would leave Emily with as little as possible while safeguarding his own future. Months later, as the divorce was finalized, James stood outside the courthouse, a bittersweet sense of relief washing over him. He had faced the darkest chapter of his life and come out stronger. Emily and Trevor were no longer part of his world, and the family's unity was fractured. But James had reclaimed his dignity and his freedom. For the first time in years, he felt hope. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one without lies, betrayal, or the weight of a broken marriage. James was ready to move forward, leaving the past behind and embracing the life he deserved. The room was thick with unspoken words as Emily sat hunched over, defeated, while James stood tall, his resolve unwavering. The air between them felt heavier than it ever had during their 17 years together. James took a deep breath, his tone calm yet cutting. I gave you everything, Emily. My time, my effort, my loyalty. And in return, you gave me lies and betrayal. Emily's voice cracked as she tried to speak. James, He raised a hand, silencing her. Don't. I'm not here for excuses. I'm here for the truth. And now I have it. All of it. He pointed to the evidence on the table. Do you see this? These are the years of your deception laid bare. Every business trip, every lie, every moment you spent with someone else while I was here, building a life for us. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she whispered, I made mistakes, but it wasn't all lies. There were good moments, too. I loved you, James. No, you didn't, he said firmly. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't betray. Love doesn't break someone the way you've broken me. Emily sobbed, her shoulders shaking, but James didn't flinch. He had spent too long forgiving, excusing, and overlooking. This time, he would not bend. I'm done, Emily, he said, his voice steady. This marriage is over. I've already contacted my lawyer, and the divorce papers will be filed this week. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Please, James, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll change. I'll do anything. James shook his head. No, Emily. You don't get to decide now. You had years to fix this, to come clean, to be honest. You chose not to. He gathered the evidence into a folder and straightened up, his gaze never leaving hers. I'm leaving this house. You'll hear from my lawyer soon. And don't expect me to make this easy for you. As he turned to leave, Emily cried out, James, please. I still love you. He paused at the doorway, his back to her. Maybe you think you do, he said, his voice soft but firm. But love isn't what you've shown me, and I deserve better. James left the house that night with nothing but his resolve and the determination to rebuild his life. The weight of betrayal still bore down on him, but he knew he had taken the first step toward freedom. In the weeks that followed, James began to focus on himself, securing his financial assets, reconnecting with old friends, and rediscovering the parts of himself he had lost in the marriage. The divorce proceedings were messy, with Emily pleading for reconciliation, but James remained firm. He knew that trust, once broken so deeply, could never be restored. The wounds would take time to heal, but James was ready to face the future on his terms. The lies and betrayal were behind him now, and he vowed to never let himself be deceived again. As he signed the final divorce papers, James felt a bittersweet sense of relief. It was the end of a painful chapter, but also the beginning of something new, something honest, something true. James paced the room, trying to collect his thoughts. His heart was beating faster than usual. He realized that no apologies, no explanations could change what had happened. "I can't forgive this," he finally said, stopping near the door. "I don't want to hear any more excuses. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Emily looked up, but before she could say anything, James was already leaving the room. He left the house and stepped outside. The air was cool, but it felt like he could finally breathe freely. The pain lingered, but with it came a sense of relief. This wasn't my fault, he thought. I did everything I could. Now it's her burden to bear. A few weeks passed after that emotional conversation. James stayed in their house, though every time he saw Emily, the sense of betrayal overwhelmed him. She seemed broken, trying to make amends. Staying home more often, being more attentive, even suggesting they start family therapy. James felt like they were trying to glue back together something that had long since shattered. But deep down, he didn't believe in her sincerity. His intuition, which had been silent for so long, now screamed. This wasn't over. One evening, coming home earlier than usual, James saw Emily sitting on the couch, deeply engrossed in her phone. When he entered the room, she quickly locked the screen and placed the device on the table. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Nothing important," she replied, but her voice trembled. That moment reminded him of the past months when she had hidden her affairs. His suspicions reignited with renewed intensity. James reached out to the same private investigator who had helped him gather evidence before. He asked him to check on Emily again, this time with maximum thoroughness. Over the course of a week, James received reports. At first, nothing seemed suspicious. Emily stayed home, went to the store, met with a friend. But on one particular day, the investigator reported that Emily had met a man at a cafe. They sat together for over an hour, exchanging warm smiles and touching hands. James received photographs of the meeting. His heart sank. She was doing it again. The next evening, James waited for Emily to return home. His hands trembled, but this time it wasn't from sadness or anger. It was determination. "We need to talk," he said as she walked into the living room. Emily sat down, looking wary. "What's wrong?" "It hasn't ended, has it?" he asked, his voice cold but calm. "What are you talking about?" she replied, her voice steady, but her eyes avoided his gaze. James placed the photographs in front of her. Her face instantly turned pale. "It's not what you think," she began, but James interrupted. "Not what I think? How many more times am I going to hear that, Emily?" She tried to explain. "He's just a friend. Nothing more, I swear." "And what about what you said last time? You swore then, too, that it wouldn't happen again. And yet, here we are." Emily began to cry, but this time her tears didn't move James. He stood before her, as if looking at a stranger. "This is the end, Emily," he finally said. "I can't do this anymore. I won't. I won't let you destroy me again." Months passed after James finally cut ties with Emily. The pain still lingered, but he was slowly beginning to breathe again. His new home became a symbol of freedom, though the empty rooms sometimes reminded him of loneliness. One evening, returning from the supermarket, James noticed a car pulling up in front of his driveway. A young woman with luxurious red curls stepped out, looking slightly flustered. "Excuse me," she said, noticing James. "I just moved in and can't find my key." James smiled. "Let me help you." Her name was Rachel, and she had just moved into the house next door. Their conversation, which began as a simple exchange of pleasantries, quickly turned into playful banter. Rachel's easygoing nature and charming smile seemed to melt away the remnants of ice around James's heart. In the early weeks following his breakup with Emily, when James was still in a chaotic emotional state, he once allowed himself to do something he would never have done before. An evening at a bar with a friend ended with a conversation with a woman who approached him. She was confident, and her interest in him was obvious. James knew it was wrong, but the desire to escape the pain of betrayal took over. The night ended with a passionate kiss by her car, but he didn't let it go further. It was just a fleeting moment that showed him he was still capable of feeling. With Rachel, things were different. They started spending more time together. Morning coffees, walks in the park, and long conversations about life. She was open, warm, and, most importantly, sincere. One evening, Rachel invited James over for dinner. Her home was cozy and filled with the aromas of spices. The dinner was relaxed, but there was a tension in the air. As James was about to leave, Rachel gently touched his hand. "You can stay," she said softly but confidently. James hesitated. It had been a long time since he allowed himself to be close to another woman, but in Rachel's eyes, he saw something that made him take a step forward. The night was tender, filled with trust and new sensations. Their touches were careful yet passionate. James felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crumble. The next morning, as James returned home, he saw a familiar car parked in front of his house. It was Emily. She looked exhausted, as though she was experiencing the same emotions he had endured months earlier. "James, can I talk to you?" she asked, standing on the porch. He hesitated but let her in. "I know I've hurt you," she began, "and I know I can't undo it, but I've changed. I want to fix what I've broken." James looked at her, and there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. He saw sincerity in her, but at the same time, he remembered the betrayal that still burned his soul. "Emily, it's too late," he replied. "I can't live with what happened. You had your chance, and you lost it." Emily broke into tears. "I love you, James. I've always loved you." "Then why did you do it?" His voice trembled. She couldn't answer. James realized that no matter how much she tried to win him back, he had already made his choice. James escorted Emily to the door and said for the last time, "I hope you find your happiness, but mine is no longer with you." That evening, he met with Rachel again. Her presence had become his medicine, helping heal old wounds. He realized that the past no longer held him hostage, and he was ready for a new life. The relationship between James and Rachel progressed quickly yet naturally. Her honesty and warmth helped him heal, and he began to feel that he had finally found what he had been searching for all his life. But even in the best moments, James noticed a shadow of doubt in Rachel's eyes. One evening, sitting together on the couch after a cozy dinner, Rachel suddenly asked, "James, have you ever thought that I could be like her?" "Like who?" he asked, surprised, though the answer was obvious. "Like Emily," she said quietly, lowering her gaze. "That I could do something like she did. That one day you might lose trust in me too." James took her hand. "Rachel, I know betrayal leaves a mark, but you shouldn't compare yourself to her. You're different." "But you thought the same about her once, didn't you?" she pressed. James couldn't deny it. He had believed in Emily until the truth shattered his illusions. But he didn't want the past to destroy his future. The following weeks were difficult. Rachel, though she tried not to show her fears, began asking more questions. When James was late at work, she sent messages trying to gauge if everything was all right. She observed his tone, his reactions, even small details. One day, while he was on the phone with a colleague, Rachel interrupted him with a direct question. "Was that a woman?" "Yes, but she's just a colleague," he replied, but doubt lingered in her eyes. James knew this wasn't just about Rachel. It was about the scars left by his past and the lingering distrust that threatened to creep into his new relationship. He realized they needed to confront these fears together if they wanted to build something lasting. "I know this sounds foolish," she said later that night, "but I don't want to be the one who turns a blind eye while something happens behind my back." James realized it wasn't just her fear. It was a fear inherited from his own history. James decided he wouldn't let that fear ruin their relationship. He started doing everything he could to show her she was the only one for him. He surprised her with spontaneous dates, left sweet notes on her mirror, and even showed up at her workplace once with her favorite flowers. "You really don't have to do this," she said with a smile as he appeared in her office with a large bouquet of lilies. "But I want to," he replied, "because you're all I need." One night, however, became a turning point. James was busy working on an important project and stayed at the office later than usual. Rachel couldn't sleep and called him. When he answered, she was crying. "I'm scared, James," she confessed. "I know you're not Emily, but I can't shake this fear." James came home earlier than planned that night. He sat beside her on the couch, took her hands, and looked her straight in the eyes. "Rachel, do you know why I never cheated on her?" he asked. She shook her head. "Because I'm not capable of it. Because I believe love is honesty and respect. If I didn't do it then, I certainly won't now that I've found you." Rachel looked at him and smiled through her tears. "You make me believe that." That conversation became a turning point for both of them. Rachel began to trust him more, and James learned to be more open, even when he wasn't sure how to express himself. Their relationship grew stronger because they both realized trust is something you build together. Despite their efforts, James and Rachel's relationship began to show signs of strain. Rachel's lingering fear and insecurity became an invisible barrier between them. Every gesture, every word, seemed to carry the potential for new doubts. One evening, when James came home from work slightly later than usual, he found Rachel sitting in the kitchen with her phone in her hands. Her face was tense, and her eyes were red. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing that something heavy was about to unfold. Rachel looked up at him. I saw you texting someone last night. It was a woman, wasn't it?" James sighed, trying to stay calm. "It was my colleague. We were discussing a project." "Rachel, I've told you before. I have nothing to hide." "But how can I be sure?" Her voice trembled. "I know you're kind and honest, but I can't stop being afraid that one day you'll betray me too." That conversation was just one of many. Rachel grew increasingly suspicious, and James felt more and more exhausted. No matter how much effort he put in, it seemed impossible to prove his sincerity. One evening, after yet another argument, James decided to lay everything on the table. "Rachel, I can't do this anymore," he said, looking her straight in the eyes. "I understand that you're scared, but this isn't living. You need to learn to trust, or we simply can't be together." "I'm trying," she replied, her voice filled with despair. "But it's stronger than me." "Then you need to understand that this isn't just your fear. It's our problem. And I can't be the only one fighting for this relationship anymore." The next day, James sent Rachel a message. He couldn't keep waiting and hoping things would change. "Rachel, you're a wonderful person, but we can't continue. I've realized that you're not ready to trust, and I can't live in an atmosphere of constant suspicion. It's not your fault, but I need to move on." When she read the message, her eyes filled with tears. She knew he was right, but couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. James thought long and hard about whether he'd made the right decision. The pain of the breakup was heavy, but he also felt a sense of relief. He knew that a strong relationship couldn't be built without trust. Though it was difficult to let go, James walked away with the understanding that he deserved a love free of doubt and suspicion. For the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face the future, knowing he had made the best decision for both of them. One evening, sitting on the balcony of his new house, James said to himself, "Maybe I'll meet someone who can trust again. But right now, I need to find myself." James began a new life, trying to leave the past behind. He changed jobs, settled into his new house, and even started attending courses to focus on personal development. It seemed like everything was finally falling into place. But one day, coming home, he saw a familiar car in front of his house. Emily. She was standing on the porch, looking nervous but determined. Her appearance reminded him of the Emily he once loved. Simple, sincere, but now there was a shadow of regret in her eyes. "James, can I talk to you?" she asked as he approached. He hesitated, but eventually let her in. "I know I've hurt you," she began, sitting down at the kitchen table. "And I know it may be too late, but I want to say what I should have said a long time ago." James crossed his arms, watching her closely. "I'm listening." Emily exhaled as if gathering her strength. I know I ruined our life. I made mistakes that can't be undone. But after everything that happened, I realized you were the only one who truly loved me. You were the only one who fought for us. And how did that stop you from cheating? He asked sharply. Emily lowered her head. I don't justify myself. I was selfish, weak. But after you left, I realized that I didn't just lose a husband. I lost the person who was my whole world. Her words stirred mixed feelings in James. He had always imagined how this conversation might go, but now that it was happening, he didn't feel satisfaction or relief, only emptiness. What do you want, Emily? He asked directly. I want you to give me a chance, so I can prove to you that I've changed. Her voice trembled. James was silent for a few minutes. His thoughts bounced between the past and the present. He could see that Emily was sincere, but could he trust her again? You know, Emily, he finally said, I don't care anymore whether you've changed or not. It's not about you anymore. It's about me. I can't go back to what it was. You caused me pain that left a mark, and that mark won't go away. Emily was silent, tears slowly flowing down her face. I thank you for admitting it, he continued, but I'm no longer the person who's ready to build a life with someone who once chose lies. Emily realized that there was no point in insisting anymore. She quietly stood up, walked over to him, and said, I hope you find your happiness, James. You deserve it. When Emily left, James felt unexpectedly calm. It wasn't a victory or a defeat. It was liberation. The next day, he decided to do something he had wanted to for a long time, begin a journey that had always been just a dream. He packed a backpack and went to the place he had dreamed of for years. At the top of the mountain, watching the sunset, he realized one simple thing. His life was what he made of it. The past had left its mark, but it no longer had power over him. James smiled, feeling his heart fill with peace. He knew that true happiness starts with himself. Do you think James did the right thing by refusing to give Emily a second chance, or should he have taken the risk for love?